Long before the Hittite Empire emerged, central Anatolia was already a contested landscape shaped by trade, migration, and early political ambition. Across its high plateaus and narrow valleys, small fortified settlements competed for control of resources and routes, forming a complex network of interaction that would later support one of the most powerful states of the ancient Near East. Central Anatolia in the early Bronze Age, between approximately 3000 and 2000 BCE, was defined by a distinctive and often challenging geography. The region consists primarily of elevated plateaus surrounded by mountain ranges, with limited access to fertile lowlands. Rivers such as the Kızılırmak formed natural boundaries and corridors of movement, but large-scale agricultural expansion was constrained by irregular rainfall and seasonal variation. Archaeological surveys indicate that communities adapted to these conditions by establishing settlements in defensible positions, often on elevated terrain overlooking arable land and trade routes. These environmental factors contributed to the emergence of localized political units, each centered on a fortified settlement. Excavations at sites such as Hattusa reveal that even before its later role as the Hittite capital, the area was occupied by earlier communities during the early Bronze Age. Fortification walls, storage facilities, and domestic structures indicate an organized settlement pattern with clear planning. Similarly, Alacahoyuk provides evidence of elite burials, including richly furnished tombs containing metal artifacts, ceremonial objects, and animal remains. Archaeologists uncovered these graves in the early 20th century, and their contents suggest the presence of a ruling class with access to significant resources. The distribution of wealth within these burial contexts indicates early forms of social stratification, with certain individuals or families holding elevated status within their communities. Further south, the site of Kultepe, identified with the ancient city of Kadesh, offers some of the most detailed insights into the economic and administrative life of the region. Excavations have uncovered thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform script, dating primarily to the early 2nd millennium BCE. These texts originate from Assyrian merchant colonies and document a well-developed system of long-distance trade. Records indicate the exchange of tin and textiles from Mesopotamia for silver and other local resources. Contracts, loan agreements, and correspondence preserved in these tablets demonstrate a high degree of economic organization and legal structure. According to these records, merchants operated within established frameworks that included taxation, dispute resolution, and standardized measures. The presence of Assyrian merchants at Kadesh illustrates the integration of central Anatolia into broader Near Eastern trade networks. Trade routes connected the region to northern Mesopotamia, facilitating not only the exchange of goods, but also the transmission of ideas, technologies, and administrative practices. Archaeologists have identified caravan routes linking Anatolia with cities such as Ashur, indicating sustained interaction over several generations. This external influence contributed to the gradual adoption of writing systems and bureaucratic methods, which would later become central to Hittite administration. Material culture from this period further reflects technological advancement and regional variation. Metallurgical evidence indicates that Anatolian communities were actively engaged in the production and use of bronze, combining copper and tin to create more durable tools and weapons. Artifacts recovered from burial sites and settlements include weapons, tools, and decorative objects, suggesting both practical and symbolic uses of metalwork. Pottery styles vary across regions, indicating localized traditions alongside shared influences. These variations provide insight into the cultural diversity of Anatolia prior to political unification. Settlement patterns during this period reveal a network of independent or semi-independent polities. Each settlement appears to have exercised control over its immediate surroundings, including agricultural land and local trade routes. Fortification walls and defensive structures indicate that conflict between neighboring groups was a recurring feature of the landscape. Evidence of destruction layers at several sites suggests episodes of warfare or internal unrest. At the same time, the existence of trade networks implies a degree of cooperation and mutual dependence among these communities. Records from Kadesh also provide indirect evidence for the presence of Indo-European-speaking groups in Anatolia during this period. Personal names recorded in the tablets differ from those of Assyrian origin, indicating a linguistically diverse population. Scholars have identified some of these names as early forms of Indo-European languages, which would later be associated with the Hittites. While the precise process of migration and integration remains debated, the textual and archaeological evidence suggests a gradual blending of populations rather than a single large-scale invasion. This process contributed to the formation of new cultural and political identities over time. Religious practices in early Bronze Age Anatolia are less well documented, but archaeological findings provide some indication of ritual activity. Objects such as figurines, altars, and ceremonial vessels have been discovered at multiple sites, suggesting the presence of localized cult practices. Burial customs, particularly at Alacahoyuk, indicate beliefs related to the afterlife and the social significance of funerary rituals. The inclusion of valuable goods in elite tombs suggests that religious and social hierarchies were closely interconnected. The combination of geographic constraints, economic interaction, and cultural diversity created a dynamic environment in central Anatolia during this period. Communities were required to adapt to limited resources while maintaining connections with external trade networks. This balance between isolation and interaction contributed to the development of complex social and political structures. Over time, the accumulation of wealth, technological advancement, and administrative practices allowed certain settlements to expand their influence beyond local boundaries. Archaeological evidence indicates that by the end of the early Bronze Age, some settlements had begun to exert control over neighboring territories, marking the initial stages of political consolidation. Fortification systems became more extensive and settlement hierarchies more pronounced, with larger centers dominating smaller surrounding communities. These developments suggest a shift from purely local governance toward more centralized forms of authority. As trade networks intensified and external influences expanded, new political identities began to form, setting the stage for the rise of the Hittites. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the foundations of a new political power were quietly taking shape in Anatolia. What had once been a landscape of competing city-states began to shift toward centralized authority, driven by expanding trade, emerging elites, and the gradual consolidation of power. Between approximately 1900 and 1650 BCE, central Anatolia experienced a period of transformation that reshaped its political and economic structures. This transition was closely linked to the expansion of long-distance trade networks, particularly those established by Assyrian merchants operating in the region. The most significant center of this activity was Kultepe, identified with the ancient city of Kadesh. Excavations at the site have uncovered thousands of clay tablets, written in Old Assyrian cuneiform, providing detailed insight into the economic and administrative systems of the time. These records indicate that Kadesh functioned as a major Tajiri hub, where Assyrian merchants established a harem, or trading colony, integrated within the local city. Contracts preserved in the tablets document the exchange of tin and textiles imported from Mesopotamia in return for silver sourced from Anatolia. The texts also reveal complex financial arrangements, including credit systems, partnerships, and legal enforcement mechanisms. According to these records, merchants operated under regulated conditions, paying taxes to local authorities while maintaining ties to their home city of Ashur. This arrangement demonstrates the coexistence of foreign commercial activity with local political structures. The presence of Assyrian merchants had broader implications beyond economic exchange. Records indicate that local elites engaged directly with these traders, adopting elements of Mesopotamian administrative practices, including written documentation and standardized accounting. Archaeologists have noted that the introduction of writing into Anatolia during this period was closely tied to these commercial interactions. This development marks one of the earliest instances of literacy in the region, laying the groundwork for later state administration under the Hittites. At the same time, the political landscape of central Anatolia began to shift. The network of independent city-states that had characterized the early Bronze Age gradually gave way to larger territorial entities. Evidence from both archaeological remains and textual sources suggests increasing competition among regional powers for control over trade routes and resource-rich areas. Fortification systems became more elaborate and settlement hierarchies more defined, indicating the emergence of centralized authority within certain polities. Among the figures associated with this transformation, Anita stands out as one of the earliest historically attested rulers in Anatolia. Known primarily through the so-called Anita text, preserved in later Hittite copies, he is described as the king of Kasara, a city whose precise location remains uncertain but is believed to have been situated in central or southern Anatolia. The text records his military campaigns against neighboring cities, including Zalpa and Hattusa, and provides insight into the processes of territorial expansion and political consolidation. According to the inscription, Anita captured Hattusa, destroyed it, and issued a curse against anyone who might attempt to rebuild the city. The text states that he sowed the site with weeds, symbolizing its complete abandonment. This act reflects both the strategic importance of Hattusa and the intensity of regional rivalries during this period. Archaeological evidence at Hattusa supports the occurrence of destruction layers dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, consistent with the events described in the text. Despite Anita's efforts to eliminate Hattusa as a political center, the city would later be reoccupied and transformed into the capital of the Hittite state. This development occurred under the rule of Hattusili I, who re-established the site and adopted its name as part of his royal title. The decision to rebuild Hattusa, despite its earlier destruction and symbolic curse, indicates a shift in political strategy. Its location offered strategic advantages, including defensible terrain and access to key routes, making it suitable as a central administrative and military hub. The emergence of rulers such as Anita and Hattusili I reflects a broader pattern of political centralization in Anatolia during this period. Textual evidence suggests the development of dynastic continuity, with power being transferred within ruling families rather than through purely competitive or fragmented systems. This shift allowed for greater stability and the accumulation of authority over multiple generations. At the same time, the expansion of territorial control required the integration of diverse populations, including both indigenous groups and Indo-European-speaking elites. Records from Kadesh provide indirect evidence for the presence of Indo-European languages in Anatolia during this period. Personal names recorded in the tablets differ from those of Assyrian origin, and linguistic analysis has identified elements consistent with early Indo-European forms. Scholars suggest that these groups gradually established dominance over existing populations, not through a single event, but through a process of integration and political consolidation. This process contributed to the formation of a distinct Hittite identity, combining linguistic, cultural, and political elements. Archaeological findings further support the emergence of centralized authority. Settlement patterns indicate the growth of larger urban centers, surrounded by smaller dependent communities. Fortification walls, administrative buildings, and storage facilities reflect increasing organizational complexity. These developments suggest that certain polities were able to mobilize labor and resources on a scale not previously seen in the region. The ability to control trade routes, collect tribute, and maintain standing forces became defining features of these emerging states. The interaction between economic expansion and political consolidation played a central role in this transformation. Trade networks provided access to resources and wealth, while also necessitating the development of administrative systems to manage transactions and enforce agreements. At the same time, competition over these networks drove military conflict and territorial expansion. This dynamic created conditions in which successful rulers could extend their authority beyond local boundaries, forming the basis of larger political entities. By the mid-17th century BCE, these processes had resulted in the formation of a unified kingdom in central Anatolia. While the precise sequence of events remains partially obscured by limited sources, the combined evidence from inscriptions, tablets, and archaeological remains indicates a clear trajectory towards state formation. The emergence of centralized authority, supported by economic integration and military capability, marked a decisive shift from the fragmented landscape of earlier periods. With political authority consolidating, the Hittite state soon turned outward, initiating a period of military expansion and imperial ambition that in a single generation, the Hittites transformed from a regional kingdom into a force capable of reaching the heart of Mesopotamia. What began as a consolidation of power in central Anatolia quickly evolved into sustained military campaigns that extended Hittite influence far beyond its original borders. Around the mid-17th century BCE, the political structures established in central Anatolia began to support a new phase of territorial expansion. This period, known as the Hittite Old Kingdom, is generally associated with the reign of Hattusili I, who is credited with initiating systematic campaigns beyond Anatolia. From the capital at Hattusa, Hattusili directed military operations toward the south, particularly into northern Syria, a region of strategic and economic importance. Northern Syria during this period was characterized by a network of wealthy city-states that controlled key trade routes linking Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean. Among these centers, Aleppo held particular significance as both a political and religious hub. Hittite campaign records, preserved in later copies of royal annals, indicate that Hattusili conducted multiple expeditions into this region. These texts describe a sequence of military engagements, including sieges, alliances, and the imposition of tribute. The campaigns appear to have been methodical, aimed at weakening regional powers and securing access to trade corridors rather than immediate territorial annexation. The structure of Hittite military operations during this period reflects a developing capacity for long-distance campaigning. Armies were composed of infantry, chariot units, and support personnel, requiring logistical coordination over extended distances. Records indicate that campaigns often took place over multiple seasons, with armies returning to Anatolia between expeditions. This pattern suggests both the limitations and the growing sophistication of Hittite military organization. Archaeological evidence from sites in southern Anatolia and northern Syria, including destruction layers and changes in material culture, supports the occurrence of these campaigns. The expansion initiated by Hattusili I reached its most dramatic phase under his successor, Mursili I. According to Hittite and later Mesopotamian sources, Mursili led a campaign deep into Mesopotamia, culminating in the sack of Babylon around 1595 BCE. This event marked one of the most significant military actions of the Late Bronze Age. Babylon, at the time ruled by the Amorite dynasty, was a major political and cultural center. The Hittite assault resulted in the removal of the ruling dynasty and the disruption of established power structures in the region. Cuneiform records from Mesopotamia, combined with Hittite accounts, confirm that the campaign reached Babylon and resulted in its temporary occupation. However, there is no evidence that the Hittites attempted to maintain long-term control over the city. Instead, the campaign appears to have been a demonstration of military capability and an effort to disrupt rival powers. The withdrawal of Hittite forces shortly after the sack suggests logistical constraints and the difficulty of sustaining authority over distant territories. The consequences of this campaign were significant for the broader Near Eastern political landscape. The fall of Babylon created a power vacuum that was eventually filled by the Kassites, who established a new ruling dynasty. This shift altered the balance of power in Mesopotamia and reduced the influence of the Amorite kingdoms. For the Hittites, the campaign demonstrated their ability to project power over long distances, but it also exposed the limitations of their administrative and logistical systems. Internally, the Old Kingdom faced persistent challenges related to political stability. The assassination of Mursili I upon his return from Babylon, as recorded in later Hittite texts, marked the beginning of a period of dynastic conflict. Royal succession was not governed by a fixed system, leading to disputes among members of the ruling family and the broader elite. These conflicts often resulted in violent power struggles, undermining the authority of the central government. The instability of succession had direct implications for the cohesion of the kingdom. Without a clear mechanism for the transfer of power, each transition created uncertainty and the potential for fragmentation. Hittite edicts from later periods, particularly the Telopinu Edict, refer retrospectively to this era as one marked by disorder and internal conflict. These texts suggest that the lack of institutionalized succession procedures was recognized as a structural weakness within the state. Archaeological evidence from Anatolia during this period reflects both expansion and instability. Some sites show signs of increased urban development, including larger fortifications and more complex settlement layouts. At the same time, other sites exhibit evidence of destruction or abandonment, indicating periods of conflict or economic disruption. The variation in settlement patterns suggests that while the central authority was capable of expansion, it was not consistently able to maintain control across all regions. The relationship between military expansion and internal stability was a defining feature of the Old Kingdom. While campaigns into Syria and Mesopotamia brought wealth and prestige, They also placed significant demands on the state's resources. The need to mobilize armies, maintain supply lines, and manage newly acquired territories required administrative systems that were still in the process of development. This imbalance between expansion and consolidation contributed to the emergence of internal tensions. At the same time, the Old Kingdom established key elements of Hittite statecraft that would persist in later periods. The use of royal annals to record military campaigns reflects an early form of state-sponsored historiography, intended to legitimize the authority of the king and document his achievements. The integration of conquered territories through tribute and alliances laid the foundation for later systems of vassal governance. These practices indicate an evolving understanding of how to manage a multi-regional state. By the end of the 16th century BCE, the Hittite kingdom had established itself as a major power in the Near East, capable of influencing events far beyond its original homeland. However, the combination of external expansion and internal instability created conditions that were difficult to sustain. The absence of a stable succession system, combined with the logistical challenges of maintaining distant campaigns, limited the long-term effectiveness of early imperial policies. Despite early successes, internal instability soon threatened the cohesion of the kingdom, leading to a period of fragmentation that as quickly as the Hittite Empire had risen, it began to fracture from within. What had once been a unified and expanding kingdom was increasingly defined by internal conflict, contested succession, and the gradual erosion of centralized authority. The assassination of Mursili I in the late 16th century BCE marked a turning point in Hittite history. According to later Hittite sources, his death was the result of a palace conspiracy involving close members of the royal family. This event did not represent an isolated incident, but rather the beginning of a prolonged period of instability characterized by repeated coups and violent struggles for power. In the absence of a clearly defined system of succession, authority within the Hittite state became increasingly contested. Following Mursili's death, a series of rulers ascended to the throne under uncertain circumstances. Contemporary records from this period are limited, but later texts, particularly royal edicts, provide retrospective accounts of the instability. These sources describe a pattern in which kings were frequently overthrown or assassinated, often by relatives or high-ranking officials. The concentration of power within the royal household, combined with the lack of institutional safeguards, created conditions in which political authority could be challenged with relative ease. The central problem during this period was the absence of a formalized succession system. Unlike later periods where inheritance followed more predictable lines, early Hittite kingship appears to have been determined through a combination of lineage, political support, and military strength. This ambiguity allowed multiple claimants to assert legitimacy, leading to recurring conflicts. These struggles not only weakened the authority of individual rulers but also undermined the stability of the state as a whole. One of the most significant sources for understanding this period is the so-called Telepainu Edict, issued by Telepainu in the mid-16th century BCE. Preserved on cuneiform tablets discovered at Hattusa, the edict provides both a historical account of earlier rulers and a set of legal reforms aimed at stabilizing the monarchy. The text recounts the sequence of violent successions following Mursili I, presenting them as a period of disorder and decline. According to the edict, Telepainu sought to address these issues by establishing clear rules for royal succession. The document specifies that the throne should pass first to the king's son, and in the absence of a direct heir, to other members of the royal family in a defined order. It also includes provisions designed to limit the influence of external actors, particularly members of the aristocracy, in determining succession outcomes. By codifying these rules, Telepainu attempted to reduce the likelihood of future disputes and ensure a more orderly transfer of power. In addition to succession reforms, the edict reflects broader efforts to reassert central authority. It emphasizes the importance of loyalty to the king and outlines penalties for acts of rebellion or treachery. These measures indicate an attempt to strengthen the institutional framework of the state, moving beyond reliance on individual rulers toward more formalized systems of governance. While it is difficult to assess the immediate effectiveness of these reforms, their preservation in later copies suggests that they were regarded as foundational in subsequent periods. Archaeological evidence from Anatolia during this time supports the picture of a contracting and less stable state. Excavations at several sites indicate a reduction in urban activity, with some settlements showing signs of partial abandonment or decreased population. Fortification systems, which had expanded during the Old Kingdom, appear to have been maintained but not significantly extended. This suggests that resources were increasingly directed toward internal security rather than external expansion. The Hittite presence in northern Syria, established during earlier campaigns, also appears to have diminished during this period. Textual and archaeological evidence indicates that control over key cities weakened, allowing other regional powers to reassert influence. This loss of external territories reduced access to trade networks and resources, further limiting the state's capacity for recovery. The contraction of territorial control reflects the broader impact of internal instability on the empire's ability to project power. At the same time, evidence suggests that the core regions of central Anatolia remained under Hittite control. The continued occupation of key sites, including Hattusa, indicates that the state did not collapse entirely but rather underwent a period of reorganization. Administrative practices, including the use of cuneiform writing, persisted, although the volume of surviving records from this period is limited. This continuity suggests that despite political instability, certain institutional structures remained intact. The relationship between internal governance and external power during this period is a central feature of Hittite history. The inability to maintain stable succession directly affected the state's capacity to manage its territories and resources. Without consistent leadership, long-term planning and coordination became difficult, leading to a cycle in which internal conflict weakened external control, and reduced external resources further intensified internal competition. Telopainu's reforms can be understood as an attempt to break this cycle by introducing predictability into the system of governance. By defining succession rules and reinforcing the authority of the monarchy, these measures aim to create a more stable political environment. While the immediate results are not fully documented, the principles outlined in the edict appear to have influenced later developments in Hittite administration. By the early 15th century BCE, the period of intense internal conflict began to subside. Although the state had lost much of its earlier territorial reach, the consolidation of authority within the core regions provided a basis for future recovery. The institutional changes introduced during this period contributed to the gradual reestablishment of centralized control, setting the stage for the emergence of a more structured and resilient political system. With political order gradually restored, the Hittites entered a new phase of expansion and international diplomacy. By the mid-14th century BCE, the Hittites stood among the great powers of the ancient world. From their capital in Anatolia, they projected military strength, diplomatic influence, and administrative control across a vast and interconnected political landscape. The reemergence of Hittite power in the 14th century BCE is closely associated with the reign of Suppiluliuma I, whose rule marked the beginning of the Hittite New Kingdom's most expansive phase. Building upon the institutional reforms of earlier rulers, Suppiluliuma consolidated authority within central Anatolia before initiating a series of campaigns that would extend Hittite influence into northern Syria and beyond. His reign is documented through a combination of royal annals, diplomatic correspondence, and archaeological evidence, providing one of the most detailed records of Hittite imperial activity. From the capital at Hattusa, Suppiluliuma directed military operations against neighboring states, most notably the Kingdom of Mitanni. At the time, Mitanni controlled significant portions of northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia, serving as a major rival to Hittite expansion. Hittite records indicate that Suppiluliuma exploited internal divisions within Mitanni, supporting rival claimants to the throne and intervening militarily to secure favorable outcomes. This combination of diplomatic maneuvering and military force allowed the Hittites to dismantle Mitanni's influence and establish dominance over key territories. Campaign accounts preserved in Hittite texts describe the capture of strategic cities, including Carchemish and Aleppo, both of which held significant economic and political value. Rather than annexing these regions directly, Suppiluliuma implemented a system of vassal governance. Local rulers were either replaced or subordinated, required to swear loyalty to the Hittite king and provide tribute. This system allowed the Hittite state to extend its influence without the administrative burden of direct control over distant territories. Inscriptions and treaty texts recovered from Hattusa outline the obligations of these vassal states, including military support and economic contributions. The structure of Hittite imperial administration during this period reflects a high degree of organization. Central authority was maintained through a network of officials and governors, supported by written records and standardized procedures. Archives discovered at Hattusa contain diplomatic correspondence, legal documents, and administrative records, indicating a sophisticated bureaucratic system. These texts demonstrate the use of cuneiform writing for both internal governance and international communication, facilitating coordination across the empire. The Hittite state under Suppiluliuma was also integrated into the broader system of late Bronze Age diplomacy. One of the most significant sources for this period is the corpus of diplomatic correspondence known as the Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt and dating to the 14th century BCE. These tablets include exchanges between major powers such as Egypt, Mitanni, Babylon, and the Hittites, revealing a network of relationships based on diplomacy, marriage alliances, and gift exchange. Within this system, the Hittite king is addressed as an equal by other rulers, reflecting the recognition of Hittite power at the international level. The Amarna letters indicate that diplomatic relations were governed by established conventions, including the exchange of envoys and the use of Akkadian as a common diplomatic language. These communications provide insight into the negotiation of alliances, the resolution of disputes, and the management of political relationships across large distances. The inclusion of Hittite rulers in this correspondence confirms their status as one of the primary actors in the international system of the time. One of the most notable episodes of Suppiluliuma's reign involves his interaction with Egypt following the death of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. According to Hittite records, an Egyptian queen, often identified as Ankhesenamun, sent a letter to Suppiluliuma requesting a Hittite prince as a husband, stating that she had no suitable heir and wished to avoid marrying a commoner. This request is preserved in Hittite texts and represents an unusual instance of diplomatic outreach. Suppiluliuma initially responded with caution, sending an envoy to verify the authenticity of the request. After confirmation, Suppiluliuma dispatched one of his sons to Egypt. However, the prince was killed en route, under circumstances that remain unclear. Hittite sources attribute the death to Egyptian involvement, though direct evidence is limited. This event led to a deterioration in relations between the two powers and prompted further military actions in Syrian territories influenced by Egypt. The episode illustrates both the opportunities and risks associated with international diplomacy during this period. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa and other sites reflects the prosperity and organizational capacity of the Hittite state at its peak. Monumental architecture, including city walls, gates, and temples, demonstrates the ability to mobilize large labor forces and manage complex construction projects. Storage facilities and administrative buildings indicate centralized control over resources, while the scale of the archives suggests a high level of record-keeping and governance. These features collectively point to a well-developed imperial system capable of sustaining large populations and coordinating activities across multiple regions. The expansion of the Hittite Empire under Suppiluliuma also increased its reliance on a network of political relationships. The vassal system required ongoing oversight and enforcement, as loyalty could not always be assumed. Treaties often included provisions for succession, military obligations, and penalties for disobedience, reflecting the need to manage potential instability within subordinate states. This system allowed for rapid expansion but also introduced new challenges related to communication, coordination, and control. At the same time, the integration of diverse regions into the Hittite sphere brought economic benefits. Control over trade routes facilitated the movement of goods, including metals, agricultural products, and luxury items. Tribute from vassal states contributed to the wealth of the central administration, supporting both military and infrastructural activities. These economic factors reinforced the political strength of the empire, enabling it to maintain its position among the leading powers of the ancient Near East. By the later years of Suppiluliuma's reign, the Hittite Empire had reached a level of influence that extended across Anatolia and into the Levant. Its ability to combine military force with diplomatic strategy allowed it to navigate a complex and competitive geopolitical environment. However, the very systems that supported this expansion, particularly the reliance on vassal states and international alliances, introduced dependencies that required constant management. As the empire reached its peak, it became increasingly entangled in large-scale regional conflicts. Kadesh. Two of the ancient world's greatest powers collided in a battle that neither could decisively win. The confrontation between the Hittites and Egyptians would become a defining moment in the military and diplomatic history of the Late Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire, at the height of its new kingdom strength, confronted a major rival in the Egyptian kingdom of Ramesses II. The strategic focus of this rivalry was the Levant, particularly the region of Syria, where control over trade routes, fortified cities, and resource-rich territories was essential for maintaining imperial influence. By the late 13th century BCE, the Hittites had established a network of vassal states and fortified positions in northern and central Syria, positioning them as the principal power in the region. The Egyptians, seeking to secure their northern frontier and maintain access to the Levantine corridor, mounted campaigns to assert control, leading to inevitable confrontation. The Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE near the Orontes River in modern Syria, represents one of the most documented military engagements of the ancient Near East. Hittite sources, preserved on cuneiform tablets in Anatolia, and Egyptian inscriptions at temples in Luxor and Abu Simbel provide extensive narratives, although each source emphasizes its own perspective. Egyptian records portray Ramesses II as achieving a personal, heroic victory, whereas Hittite texts describe successful maneuvers by their king, Mursili II, and the effective use of intelligence and strategic positioning. Modern analysis suggests that the battle resulted in a tactical stalemate. Ramesses II advanced toward Kadesh with a large army, including chariot units, infantry, and auxiliary forces drawn from allied states. Hittite forces employed deception by splitting their army and ambushing one of the Egyptian flanks, temporarily causing confusion and significant casualties. However, reinforcements and tactical adaptation prevented a complete Egyptian rout. Archaeological studies, including surveys of the battlefield region, corroborate the presence of fortifications and evidence of large-scale troop movement, supporting the historical plausibility of the engagement. The strategic significance of Kadesh was not limited to immediate military outcomes. Control of the surrounding territories allowed for the regulation of trade routes connecting Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean. The battle underscored the importance of Syria as a contested buffer zone between the two empires. Both sides recognized that outright conquest was difficult to maintain over these distant and culturally diverse lands, leading to a gradual shift from purely expansionist objectives to strategic control and influence. In the aftermath of Kadesh, prolonged diplomatic negotiations began, reflecting the sophistication of late Bronze Age interstate relations. These negotiations culminated in the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty around 1259 BCE, one of the earliest known formal agreements between two major powers. The treaty, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions and Hittite cuneiform tablets, established mutually recognized borders, clauses of non-aggression, and provisions for mutual defense in the event of external threats. The agreement also included dynastic marriage arrangements designed to solidify alliances and enhance political legitimacy. The treaty demonstrates a shift in Hittite strategy from aggressive expansion to the management and maintenance of imperial power. By securing diplomatic recognition from Egypt, the Hittites ensured the stability of their southern frontier, allowing resources and attention to be redirected to internal governance, vassal management, and other regional concerns. The successful negotiation of the treaty reflects the administrative and diplomatic sophistication that the Hittite state had developed over centuries of imperial expansion. This period also illustrates the integration of military and diplomatic systems within the Hittite state. Campaigns such as Kadesh were coordinated with intelligence networks, logistical support, and administrative oversight from the capital at Hattusa. Royal correspondence, military rosters, and records of vassal obligations show that the empire could mobilize resources effectively while maintaining ongoing communication with subordinate territories. The combination of force and diplomacy enabled the Hittites to manage a complex geopolitical environment in which outright military conquest was often impractical. Moreover, the outcome of Kadesh had implications for the balance of power in the wider Late Bronze Age system. The stalemate signaled that neither the Hittites nor the Egyptians could dominate Syria entirely, setting a precedent for future regional negotiations and shifting the focus to strategic alliances. Vassal states in northern Syria and the Levant were required to navigate between these competing powers, maintaining their own political autonomy while fulfilling obligations to both empires. The use of dynastic marriages and treaties as instruments of diplomacy highlights the interplay between political, military, and social systems. By interlinking royal families, both the Hittites and Egyptians sought to legitimize authority and deter rebellion. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions detailing these marriages and the exchange of luxury goods as part of diplomatic protocols, demonstrates the material and symbolic dimensions of interstate agreements. Despite the stabilizing effect of diplomacy, systemic pressures continued to challenge the Hittite state. The reliance on vassal loyalty, the logistical demands of distant campaigns, and the complexity of maintaining alliances created vulnerabilities that required constant management. While external threats from Egypt were temporarily mitigated, these structural challenges would compound over time, influencing the trajectory of Hittite power in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. By stabilizing relations with Egypt and asserting influence over northern Syria, the Hittites secured a period of relative regional equilibrium. The Battle of Kadesh and its diplomatic aftermath exemplify the combination of military competence and administrative sophistication that characterized the new kingdom at its height. However, these same mechanisms, vassal networks, interstate treaties, and distant garrisons, also introduced dependencies and pressures that would later intersect with internal and external crises. Even as diplomacy stabilized external threats, internal and systemic pressures were beginning to mount. The Hittite Empire, while strategically adept and diplomatically integrated, faced the persistent challenge of sustaining a complex, multi-regional polity in an environment of shifting alliances, resource demands, and ongoing regional competition. At its height, the Hittite Empire depended on a fragile web of trade that stretched across the ancient world. The flow of metals, grain, and luxury goods was not just commerce. It was the backbone of political stability and military power. The Hittite economy during the 13th century BCE was closely linked to the complex trade networks of the Late Bronze Age. Central Anatolia, while strategically positioned, was limited in agricultural productivity, particularly in grain cultivation. As a result, the state relied on imports from regions such as northern Syria, the Levant, and Mesopotamia to sustain urban populations and military forces. Excavations at Hattusa and other major settlements reveal extensive storage facilities, including granaries and warehouses, indicating organized management of redistributed resources. Trade in metals was a cornerstone of the Hittite economic system. Anatolia contained significant deposits of silver and copper, which were processed into ingots and finished goods for domestic use and export. Archaeological finds, including slag heaps and metallurgical workshops, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of or extraction and metalworking. These resources were critical for producing weaponry, chariot fittings, and ceremonial items, linking economic production directly to both military capacity and political legitimacy. The empire also participated in the exchange of luxury goods, including textiles, ivory, and precious stones. Evidence from contemporary sites, such as imported Canaanite ceramics and Egyptian artifacts, reflects an active engagement with international trade networks. Diplomatic correspondence, particularly the Amarna letters, confirms the movement of gifts, raw materials, and commercial commodities between the Hittites and neighboring powers. These exchanges were not purely economic. They reinforced political alliances, secured loyalty from vassal states, and demonstrated the king's capacity to manage resources on a regional scale. Despite the sophistication of these systems, dependence on long-distance trade created structural vulnerabilities. The flow of grain and other essential goods could be disrupted by conflict, political instability, or environmental factors. Archaeological surveys indicate periods of population displacement, fortification expansion, and localized famine during the late 13th century BCE, suggesting that economic pressures were increasingly acute. Administrative texts from Hattusa and provincial centers document rationing, taxation adjustments, and logistical planning, reflecting efforts to mitigate shortages and maintain state authority. The integration of vassal territories into economic networks further increased systemic interdependence. Vassals were required to supply tribute in the form of metals, foodstuffs, and manpower, creating obligations that both reinforced loyalty and imposed constraints. Failure of a vassal to deliver resources could ripple through the empire, stressing supply chains and forcing the central administration to allocate military or diplomatic resources to enforce compliance. These dynamics highlight the delicate balance between economic reliance and political control. Environmental and climatic factors also contributed to economic pressures. Evidence from palynological studies and sediment cores indicates variability in rainfall and potential periods of drought in central Anatolia. Such conditions would have reduced crop yields and increased the empire's dependence on imported grain. Coupled with increasing demands from urban populations, military campaigns, and vassal oversight, these factors placed substantial strain on administrative systems. The state responded to these pressures through a combination of bureaucratic organization and adaptive logistics. Records indicate the deployment of officials responsible for overseeing storage, collection, and redistribution of critical goods. Centralized archives at Hattusa cataloged quantities of grain, metal, and other resources, while regional centers implemented collection and transport procedures. This system allowed the Hittite state to manage large-scale economic activity across multiple provinces, demonstrating a high degree of administrative sophistication. However, the very structures that enabled economic integration also magnified the consequences of disruption. If key trade routes were blocked, either by external aggression or internal unrest, shortages quickly emerged. Archaeological evidence from the late 13th century BCE suggests the fortification of certain settlements and the temporary abandonment of others, consistent with attempts to secure resources and population. These indicators point to the growing fragility of the empire's economic network and the pressures it imposed on both the state and its subjects. The interdependence of trade, military logistics, and political authority illustrates the systemic nature of Hittite vulnerabilities. Resource scarcity could affect the king's ability to reward vassals, field armies, or conduct diplomatic negotiations. Simultaneously, disruptions in tribute collection or transport could provoke local unrest, further exacerbating economic strain. The empire's reliance on interconnected systems of production and redistribution thus created feedback loops, where minor disturbances had the potential to generate widespread consequences. By the late 13th century BCE, the combination of economic pressures, environmental variability, and the logistical demands of empire contributed to a context in which new external threats could gain traction. The vulnerability of long-distance trade networks, coupled with the empire's dependence on vassal compliance, meant that any sustained disruption had the potential to undermine central authority. This structural fragility would play a crucial role in the events leading to the eventual destabilization and collapse of Hittite power. As economic pressures intensified, new external threats began to emerge across the eastern Mediterranean, challenging the empire's ability to maintain control over its territories and to sustain the population of central Anatolia. By the early 12th century BCE, the stability of the ancient world began to unravel. Civilizations that had thrived for centuries faced simultaneous pressures, as new external forces reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the eastern Mediterranean. The period around 1200 BCE is characterized by a dramatic and largely synchronous disruption across the eastern Mediterranean, commonly referred to as the Bronze Age collapse. Archaeological surveys reveal extensive destruction layers in Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant, often coinciding with abandoned settlements and a marked decline in urban activity. In central Anatolia, the once thriving cities of the Hittite Empire exhibit signs of fortification, destruction, or complete abandonment, suggesting that the empire was experiencing both external assault and internal breakdown. One of the most cited factors in this regional disruption is the movement of groups collectively known in Egyptian sources as the Sea Peoples. These inscriptions, primarily found in the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, depict naval incursions and battles against Egyptian forces. While their precise origins remain debated, these groups were likely composite coalitions of displaced populations, mercenaries, and raiders from the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. Their movements created widespread insecurity, particularly in coastal regions and along trade routes critical to the Hittite economy. The Sea Peoples were not a monolithic force. Rather, they appeared in multiple theaters simultaneously, targeting vulnerable regions and exploiting weakened political structures. Archaeological evidence in northern Syria and western Anatolia indicates that cities were destroyed or abandoned during this period, often with signs of fire and violent collapse. The Hittite texts from the same period are notably sparse, suggesting that the administrative apparatus of the empire was severely disrupted. Records of tribute, military campaigns, and diplomatic correspondence largely disappear, implying that central governance was either incapacitated or unable to maintain record-keeping. Compounding the impact of these incursions, paleoenvironmental studies indicate that central Anatolia experienced climatic stress during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Reduced rainfall and lower agricultural yields would have exacerbated food scarcity, particularly in grain import-dependent regions. Combined with ongoing military threats, these environmental pressures placed unprecedented strain on the Hittite administration, vassal compliance, and urban populations. Settlements that had once thrived under robust central authority now faced both resource shortages and the risk of attack. The vulnerability of Hittite urban centers is evident in archaeological stratigraphy. Excavations at Hattusa show signs of destruction and abandonment consistent with siege or conflagration, though precise attribution remains difficult. Other sites across Anatolia reveal similar patterns, with material culture, ceramics, metallurgical production, and domestic goods, showing abrupt decline. These layers indicate both immediate physical disruption and longer-term economic contraction. The collapse of regional trade networks further magnified the Hittites' difficulties. Long-distance trade, previously essential for supplying metals, grain, and luxury goods, was interrupted by the combined pressures of raiding parties and political fragmentation. Vassal states in northern Syria and the Levant became increasingly autonomous or were overrun, severing the supply chains on which the Hittite Empire relied. Textual evidence indicates that Hittite officials attempted to enforce resource collection, but the lack of surviving administrative records suggests that these efforts were largely ineffective by this stage. While the precise role of the Sea Peoples in the ultimate fall of the Hittite Empire remains debated, their incursions must be understood within a broader pattern of systemic instability. Multiple civilizations, Mycenaean Greece, the Levantine city-states, and late Bronze Age Egypt, experienced simultaneous disruptions, indicating that the collapse was not caused by a single actor but by a confluence of external pressure, internal fragility, and environmental stress. In the Hittite case, centuries of reliance on vassal compliance, long-distance trade, and centralized administration created structural weaknesses that amplified the effects of external invasions. The cumulative impact of these pressures was increasingly evident in population movements and settlement patterns. Peripheral regions were abandoned, while the Hittite heartland struggled to maintain control over remaining urban centers. Fortifications were reinforced in some areas, but archaeological evidence suggests that these measures were insufficient to prevent eventual collapse. The administrative vacuum created by the disruption of archives, tribute collection, and communication channels indicates that the state apparatus could no longer function effectively. By 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire was entering its final stage of political disintegration. While the precise timing and sequence of events remain partially obscured, it is clear that the combination of external invasions, climatic stress, economic vulnerability, and administrative breakdown created conditions that the empire could not withstand. The Sea Peoples, while only one element of this complex crisis, accelerated the weakening of regional defenses and contributed to the broader destabilization of the eastern Mediterranean. Amid this widespread disruption, the Hittite capital itself would soon face destruction. Hattusa, which had served as the administrative and ceremonial center of the empire for centuries, shows evidence of abandonment and ruin in the archaeological record. The collapse of central authority marked the end of Hittite hegemony in Anatolia and signaled the transformation of the region into a fragmented landscape of smaller, localized polities. The events of this period reflect not only the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated Bronze Age states but also the interconnectedness of political, economic, and environmental systems in shaping historical outcomes. One of the greatest empires of the Bronze Age did not fall in a single battle. It simply vanished from history. Hattusa, the administrative and ceremonial heart of the Hittite Empire, ceased to function, leaving behind ruins that would speak more than texts could. By the late 13th century BCE, The Hittite Empire was already under severe pressure from both internal and external forces. Successive generations had expanded territorial control, extended trade networks, and established a complex system of vassalage. Yet, these achievements relied on delicate balances of authority, resources, and communication. Archaeological evidence suggests that by around 1180 BCE, these systems had collapsed entirely, culminating in the abandonment of Hattusa, the capital city that had once been the seat of imperial governance. Excavations at Hattusa reveal evidence of destruction, including burned structures, toppled walls, and abandoned artifacts. Unlike other contemporary cities destroyed during regional conflicts, Hattusa was not systematically razed. Rather, the material record indicates a pattern of deliberate abandonment. Administrative buildings, temples, and fortifications were left largely intact but unoccupied. This suggests that the collapse was as much an administrative and social failure as it was a military one, with the ruling elite either displaced, eliminated, or incapable of sustaining authority. The abrupt cessation of archives at Hattusa confirms the breakdown of centralized administration. Cuneiform records, previously extensive and carefully maintained, suddenly end around this period. These documents had chronicled royal decrees, legal codes, military campaigns, and diplomatic correspondence. Their disappearance implies that the bureaucratic mechanisms essential to governing an expansive empire were no longer functional. The suddenness of this archival gap suggests that the collapse did not occur gradually but rather reached a tipping point where institutional continuity was irreversibly disrupted. Multiple factors likely contributed to this outcome. External threats, including incursions by the so-called Sea Peoples and other regional groups, had already destabilized northern Syria and Anatolia. Archaeological layers indicate destruction in peripheral settlements, which would have disrupted trade networks and resource flows essential to the capital. Simultaneously, internal pressures, including possible dynastic disputes, rebellion among vassals, and population movements, would have further weakened central authority. The interplay between these forces created systemic stress that the empire could not absorb. Economic factors played a significant role in the collapse. The Hittite reliance on imported grain, metals, and luxury goods had already made the state vulnerable to disruptions in trade routes. Evidence from storage facilities and settlement patterns indicates that supply chains were increasingly strained. Famine or shortages may have forced administrative reallocation, further undermining confidence in central governance. These pressures were compounded by environmental stress. Paleoenvironmental studies suggest periods of drought and soil depletion in central Anatolia, exacerbating resource scarcity and limiting agricultural output. While military defeat may have contributed, Hattusa's fall was not the result of a single catastrophic battle. Unlike Babylon or other contemporaneous cities, there is little evidence of sustained siege warfare. Instead, the material record supports a scenario in which the city was evacuated, perhaps systematically, as the administrative and ruling class sought safety or were displaced. The presence of intact temples and domestic areas indicates that the departure was abrupt but not violently destructive in every sector, reflecting a complex process of decline rather than simple annihilation. The disappearance of the Hittite Empire illustrates the fragility of even highly organized Bronze Age states. The integration of military, economic, and diplomatic systems allowed for rapid expansion and effective governance during the empire's peak, but the same interconnected structures created vulnerability. When trade routes faltered, vassals rebelled, or external attacks coincided with environmental stress, the empire's resilience reached its limits. Hattusa's abandonment, therefore, represents the culmination of multiple systemic failures rather than a singular event. Archaeologists also note continuity in certain peripheral regions, suggesting that Hittite influence did not vanish entirely overnight. Local rulers may have maintained traditions of governance, religious practice, or material culture even as central authority disappeared. In this sense, the empire's collapse was uneven. While Hattusa was evacuated, the remnants of Hittite civilization persisted in fragmented, regionalized forms. This fragmentation underscores the complexity of the fall and the necessity of examining both central and peripheral dynamics to understand the empire's final years. The loss of Hattusa had long-term consequences for Anatolia. Power vacuums were filled by smaller polities and migrating groups, reshaping the political and demographic landscape. Trade networks previously maintained by the Hittites were disrupted, forcing regional states to adapt to new economic realities. Yet, despite the empire's disappearance, certain administrative practices, diplomatic conventions, and cultural norms continued to influence successor societies in Anatolia and northern Syria. Although the empire disappeared, its cultural and political legacy did not. Hittite legal codes, religious traditions, and architectural practices left traces that persisted in later kingdoms. Temples, fortifications, and monumental gates influenced subsequent Anatolian states, while diplomatic precedents, such as treaty formulations and international correspondence, provided models for regional governance. The fall of Hattusa thus represents both an end and a transition. The centralized Hittite state vanished, but its institutional and cultural imprint shaped the post-Bronze Age civilizations that followed. By around 1180 BCE, the Hittite Empire had ceased to function as a coherent political entity. The deliberate abandonment of Hattusa, coupled with the collapse of administrative, economic, and military systems, marks the definitive end of a civilization that had dominated central Anatolia and exerted influence across the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. For centuries, the Hittites were forgotten, until archaeology brought their empire back into history. What had once dominated central Anatolia vanished from written memory, leaving only ruins and fragmented records to hint at its former power. Following the fall of Hattusa around 1180 BCE, the political landscape of Anatolia and northern Syria underwent profound transformation. While the centralized Hittite state ceased to exist, several smaller Neo-Hittite kingdoms emerged in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. These successor polities preserved elements of Hittite administrative practices, religious rituals, and cultural expression. Inscriptions, monumental reliefs, and city layouts from sites such as Carchemish, Malatya, and Zinkerli demonstrate continuity of Hittite artistic and political traditions, even as these states operated independently from the former imperial center. Linguistic evidence indicates that Hittite, an Indo-European language, continued to influence local dialects in these regions for centuries. Hieroglyphic Loian inscriptions, often found alongside Hittite cultural motifs, reflect both administrative continuity and adaptation to new political realities. These Neo-Hittite states maintained vassal-like relationships with neighboring powers, continuing trade networks and occasionally engaging in military alliances or conflicts. Although diminished in scale, these polities exemplify the persistence of Hittite institutional frameworks long after the collapse of Hattusa. Despite this survival, knowledge of the Hittites gradually disappeared from historical memory. Classical writers, including Assyrian and Greek historians, rarely mention Anatolian polities by name, and references to the Hittites were sparse or conflated with other groups. By the first millennium BCE, the civilization that had once rivaled Egypt and Babylon was largely absent from textual records, leaving a historiographical void that would endure for millennia. The modern rediscovery of the Hittites began in the 19th century, driven by European exploration and systematic excavation. Travelers and early archaeologists identified ruins at Bogazkale, in central Anatolia, which were later confirmed as the site of Hattusa. Excavations revealed fortified city walls, temples, royal gates, and administrative buildings, providing tangible evidence of a complex and highly organized society. These discoveries challenged prior assumptions that central Anatolia had been politically marginal during the Bronze Age and revealed the Hittites as a major imperial power. Critical breakthroughs came with the recovery and decipherment of cuneiform tablets from Hattusa and other Anatolian sites. Texts written in Hittite cuneiform preserved records of royal decrees, diplomatic correspondence, legal codes, and religious rituals. Scholars, including Bedřich Hrozný in the early 20th century, demonstrated that Hittite was an Indo-European language, confirming historical hypotheses and enabling detailed reconstruction of the empire's administration, law, and international relations. The Amarna letters, previously known from Egyptian archives, gained new context when paired with Hittite sources, illustrating the empire's diplomatic engagement with Egypt, Mitanni, and other states. Archaeological and textual evidence together revealed the sophistication of Hittite governance. Administrative systems relied on provincial oversight, tribute collection, and a hierarchical bureaucratic structure. Legal codes codified property rights, criminal penalties, and religious obligations, reflecting a society deeply concerned with order and stability. Religious texts illuminate a pantheon centered on storm gods and syncretic deities, with rituals reinforcing royal authority. These findings confirm that the Hittites were not only militarily capable but also culturally and institutionally advanced. The rediscovery of Hittite sites and texts has significantly reshaped the understanding of the Late Bronze Age. It is now clear that the Hittites were central to regional power dynamics, influencing trade, diplomacy, and conflict across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeology has revealed the empire's urban planning, fortification strategies, and artistic conventions, while cuneiform records provide a chronological framework for political events, wars, and treaties. Collectively, this evidence situates the Hittites as a foundational actor in the development of early imperial governance. Moreover, the study of the Hittites contributes to broader questions about the rise and fall of ancient empires. Patterns of administrative complexity, economic dependency, and geopolitical exposure observed in Hittite history offer insights into systemic vulnerabilities that can destabilize even highly organized states. By tracing the collapse of Hattusa and the persistence of Neo-Hittite polities, historians can examine how political, environmental, and military factors interact to produce large-scale societal transformations. In addition to academic research, public engagement with the Hittites has expanded through museums, exhibitions, and digital archives. Excavated artifacts, such as monumental reliefs from royal palaces, cuneiform tablets, and ceremonial objects, illustrate both the scale of Hittite achievement and the empire's interconnectedness with neighboring civilizations. These materials not only document historical fact but also provide a lens through which modern audiences can understand the administrative and cultural sophistication of the Bronze Age. The study of the Hittites continues to evolve. Ongoing excavations at Hattusa and Neo-Hittite sites, combined with advances in epigraphy, archaeometry, and digital mapping, are refining the chronology of events and clarifying patterns of trade, settlement, and political organization. The integration of environmental data and isotopic studies contributes to a nuanced understanding of resource management, demographic shifts, and the factors underlying the empire's collapse. Each new discovery underscores the complexity of the Hittite state and its significance in the history of early empires. Ultimately, the Hittites' post-imperial survival and modern rediscovery demonstrate the enduring impact of ancient civilizations on contemporary scholarship. From the scattered Neo-Hittite kingdoms to the archaeological breakthroughs of the 19th and 20th centuries, Hittite history offers a detailed case study in imperial formation, international diplomacy, and societal resilience. By reconnecting textual, material, and environmental evidence, scholars have reconstructed a civilization that, for centuries, had been almost entirely lost to history. The rediscovery of the Hittites continues to reshape our understanding of how and why ancient empires collapse. Their story provides a framework for examining the complex interactions of military power, economic dependence, environmental stress, and administrative capacity, offering lessons that extend beyond Anatolia to the broader study of human political history. Today, Hittite civilization stands recognized as a major Late Bronze Age power, illuminating both the achievements and vulnerabilities of early empires. Thank you for joining this journey through the rise, expansion, and fall of the Hittite Empire. If you found this exploration insightful, consider subscribing and turning on notifications to follow future deep dives into the world's great ancient civilizations. Explore history with us, one empire at a time, and uncover the stories that shaped our world.